Russia's embassy in Damascus is hit by a mortar launched from a rebel-held area. The U.S. suspends talks with Russia on the Syrian peace process. In reaction, Moscow says Washington appears to be ready to strike a deal with the devil to achieve its aims in the war-torn country. Wikileaks will release new material every week that could influence the U.S. presidential election, and that's according to its editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, who was speaking on the whistleblowing organization's 10th anniversary. It's 5 p.m. in the Russian capital. You're watching RT International with me, Marina Chashi. Welcome to the program. Now, the Russian embassy in Damascus has been hit by mortar fire from the rebel-held area. And here's RT's Murad Gizdiyev with all the details from Syria.
Well, we're told that 3 shells targeted the embassy in its vicinity. One of the shells landed inside the embassy compound and 2 shells landed very close by. Nobody was injured. However, those weren't the only shells to target Damascus. There was a lot, dozens apparently. One of the shells, one mortar round, landed just 50 meters from a hotel where I was staying in Damascus, and which I left only yesterday. We're told that they were all fired from Jobar. Jobar is the closest area that rebels hold to Damascus itself. It's a small, very much demolished enclave. But here I've got to say that we're talking about Jaish al-Islam, the army of Islam, Islamists who control this area. And they launched this attack just hours after the United States announced it's pulling out of peace talks with Russia, the Syrian peace process. No more ceasefires, no more talks, no more negotiations. And suddenly we have this unprecedented, really, in the last few weeks, attack.
Now, Washington suspended bilateral talks with Moscow on the Syrian peace process, and it took the step after denouncing the Russian military campaign against terrorist groups in Syria and blaming Moscow for the collapse of the ceasefire. But Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, says a solution to the Syrian crisis can only be reached collectively.
As for the fact that everyone's looking at Russia because of the situation in Aleppo, I hope that people will look at the other sides as well, or else you risk overlooking the actions of those who continue to fuel terrorists and fail to separate terrorists from the so-called moderate opposition. So we're not avoiding responsibility, but are convinced that this crisis can only be settled collectively, together with the US, Europe and all the key players in the region.
Earlier, the US claimed that the Russian military campaign in Syria has achieved next to nothing.
What we have seen from the Russians in the year or so since their military intervention in Syria is that they have not made much progress against ISIL.
However, Russia's effort in liberating this historic Syrian city of Palmyra from ISIL has never been mentioned by the White House spokesperson, nor the targeting of the terrorist oil convoys, a key source of their income. There's also been no mention of Russia's contribution to establish humanitarian corridors out of the embattled city of Aleppo. We asked U.S. officials if they believe their country is fulfilling its own pledges on Syria.
The State Department says Russia failed to live up to its commitments and was, quote, either unable or unwilling to ensure Syrian regime adherence to the arrangements to which Moscow agreed. Rather, the statement says Russia and the Syrian regime have chosen to pursue a military course. I asked the State Department if the U.S. lived up to its own obligations under the deal.
You said Russia did not live up to its obligations under the deal. Did the U.S. fully live up to its obligations?
We believe we did.
Did the U.S. separate the rebels from terrorists as it said it would?
As we talked about last week, the United States continued to have detailed, ongoing discussions with members of the opposition, emphasizing our view on the importance of demoralizing, of pulling apart from Nusra.
Under the deal, it was incumbent on the U.S. to get leading rebel groups to abide by the ceasefire and to separate them from al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. However, from day one of the agreement, Syria's second largest rebel group, al-Sham, came out and said that they would not abide by it, that they would not separate themselves from al-Nusra in Aleppo. To my question whether the U.S. expected a unilateral ceasefire on the part of Russia and the Syrian army, there was no clear answer at the State Department. It is also not clear if the U.S. now has its own plan of fighting al-Nusra in Aleppo, or whether Washington now just left it to Russia. For many months, the U.S. hadn't really targeted that group, even though it is al-Qaeda. Here's what the State Department said last week on that.
You hit Nusra, I believe you described it as al-Qaeda maybe in March or something, or February. It was earlier this year.
Yep.
Since then, there hasn't been any specific action against Nusra, is that right? Military action?
No, but I'd have to double check. I just can't definitively say that. As they became intermingled, and as they became intermingled in civilian areas, we've always sought to limit the possibility of civilian casualties.
Since the beginning of its operation in Syria, Russia has focused not only on ISIL, but also on al-Nusra. But in parts of Syria, al-Nusra teamed up with rebel groups that Washington considers legitimate Syrian opposition, and as a result, the U.S. had been reluctant to target them.
Now, the U.S. Secretary of State argues that Russia and Syria have rejected diplomacy when it comes to solving the Syrian crisis, opting for bombs instead.
Together, the Syrian regime and Russia seem to have rejected diplomacy in furtherance of trying to pursue a military victory over the broken bodies, the bombed-out hospitals, the traumatized children of a long-suffering land.
However, just a few days ago, leaked audio recordings revealed John Kerry venting his frustration over the lack of U.S. military force in Syria. Alexei Pushkov, the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Russian State Duma, says America's diplomacy in Syria is an attempt to overthrow President Assad's government.
One goal is to use diplomacy for the same end, to create political conditions for ousting Assad from Damascus and to replace them by some forces which are more acceptable to the United States. On the other hand, there is another dimension. It is that the United States have not enough strength and possibilities to dislodge Assad. And so, lacking military possibilities, lacking the possibility to use force against Assad, they are using diplomacy. The United States have never lost this ultimate goal of regime change. The fact that the U.S. have withdrawn with cooperation with Russia when it turned out that such diplomatic approach does not give the necessary results, it is just a proof that diplomacy was just a means to overthrow the acting government in Damascus.
Now, Russia's envoy to the UN insists there is no alternative to U.S.-Russia cooperation if a peaceful resolution for Syria is to be reached. At a media conference in New York, Vitaly Churkin faced some tough questions about Russia's campaign in Aleppo.
How do you then explain the fact that your country is carrying out an indiscriminate bombardment along with its Syrian allies, killing civilians, women and children in eastern Aleppo in defiance of international humanitarian law?
Well, first of all, of course, I cannot subscribe to the less than elegant phrasing of your question. I understand where you are coming from. Well, had it not been for our involvement in Syria, it might well be that the black flags would be flying over Damascus. You know, it could well be. Our military are trying to choose their targets very carefully. Eastern Aleppo has been taken hostage by Nusra and some others who are working with Nusra. Please give us a recipe how to deal about it. Sometimes we heard from the United States that one of the problems was that their targeting methods were much more sophisticated than others. So they were alleging that they're in a better position. They were in a better position to avoid civilian casualties. So we're saying, fine. In that case, this is another incentive for us to get together to make sure that our actions do not cause any civilian casualties. Unfortunately, it didn't work out from the perspective of the United States.
Obama administration officials earlier said that if the initial plan for Syria fails, a plan B will be carried out. So far, however, the details of the scheme are unclear. The Deputy Secretary of State was asked about this in Congress.
I'd like to understand what Plan B is. Just explain to us the elements of Plan B.
Two things, Mr. Chairman. Russia's actions. This is going, of course, to be bad for everyone, but it's going to be bad first and foremost.
I want to hear about Plan B.
Well,
I understand all the context here.
I think, sir, this is important because Russia against Russia, Assad.
Give me the elements of Plan B.
So two things. Again, the consequences of Russia, the regime, Russia's actions.
Let me just say what we already know. There is no Plan B.